Welcome back. So in this video, we're going to be loading our clean data into MySQL database, right? So, we're going to make use of Docker for that. So the first thing I'm going to do right here is to create a file, call it docker-compose.yml. That should be YML, right? So I'll move to my browser, open a new tab, and just search for MySQL Docker, right? So I'll click on the first results. And so you should already have Docker installed, in order to follow this video, right? So I'm on a Windows machine, so I have Docker Desktop installed, right? So this is what Docker Desktop looks like, right? So currently I don't have any containers running, right? But very soon we'll see how to start up my SQL container from the Docker image for MySQL. So I just scroll down using the Docker Compose style, right? So we can see an example here to start up the MySQL Docker container using Docker Compose. So I'll just copy this, then move back to my VS Code and paste it right there, right? So I'll remove this and also remove this, right? So basically, this is a specification for how we, for the containers we want to create, and basically the settings we'd like to give the containers. So this DB name right here is actually can be given any name you want, right? So any name you want to use in identifying that service or that container. Right? So I'll just name it MySQL, right? Or maybe MySQL DB, right? So that name can be any name, right? But everything you specify under this service, under any you create, has to follow a predefined, format basically. So you can specify an image. That's the image that's the container will be based on, right? So basically, you create containers from images, right? I don't need to have a command here. So this image right here is just specifying the official MySQL Docker image, right? And we have a restart always setting here. So basically, what that means is if for some reason the container is stopped, right? So maybe the container is stopped by some error within the container process. So then another container is going to be created, right? So that's just what this policy is, or what this setting is doing. And here we have specifying variables. Like, so those are the variables that will be supplied while the container is being created from the image. So this variable says MySQL root password. So I'll just type in Amdari password, right? And there are other environment variables we can have. So if we go back to the browser, let's see. So this is how to start a container from so this is the image. And if you want to create a container from an image, just using the command line, then use the docker run command, right? And you specify some tags, basically, right? So instead of typing this long command, that's why we are using Docker Compose, right? Where we can just have everything specified, and we can always just use a single command to start up all the containers within the Docker Compose file, right? So I'm just trying to look for environment variables, right? So we have the environment variables already here, and we can have MySQL root password, which we have already set. We have MySQL database. Then if we would like to create a user when the container is being created, then we can specify these two environment variables as well. So in fact, I would just copy that variable. So I'll paste it. And I would just like to create a database called DB, right? Then to create a custom user, or a new user rather. So this user will be different from the root user, right? So, well, it says this variable is mandatory, so we'll leave it as that. And for the user, I'll give that Amdari user. And the password for that user, let's call that Amdari user password, right? And that's different from the root password. And I think that's all the environment variables we need, right? So one thing I'm going to do here is at the root level right here, that's the same level as services. I'll create a volume, right? So a volume is basically like a storage, right? That is separate from the container, right? So it's external to the container. And the reason for having volumes is basically because containers are ephemeral in the sense that it's very possible for a container to be killed or to stop or something like that, right? So because of that, just like we have a restart always policy here, when another container is created, right, that container will have a different ID from the container that was stopped previously, right? So because of that, it's like you are creating an entirely new environment, right? So an entirely new MySQL environment, for example, right? But if you want it to still have the data that was generated by the previous container, then you just attach it to that same volume, right? And since a volume is external to the container, the volume will always retain data that was generated by the container, basically. So when one container goes up, it's a particular ID, give it ID1, for example. The next container that will get created will most definitely won't have the same ID as the previous container, right? But it can still attach to the same volume and have the data that was generated by the previous container. So the volume I want to create here, I'll just call that MySQL DB volume. So here I'll just give it empty curly braces like so. Right, so I can now do a volume mapping for this service or for this container. And that's going to be using volumes, right? So I'll specify MySQL DB volume, right? So this is the volume which is going to be created on my local system, right? Then the parts I would like to map to, right? So basically the parts within the container where I would like to store, data generated is going to be, so there's a specific path. All right, so it's actually this part, right? That's /var/lib/mysql. Right, so you can see the volume mapping example here. In the volume mapping example here, this is a directory on the local system, right? On the local machine, right? And this is a directory or a path within the container, right? So any data generated within that container, right? So any data generated and saved to this path or to this folder within the container is mapped to this folder on the local system, right? So if this container goes off, for example, the data will still be available, in this file path on the local system, right? So when a new container is started based on the same image and the same volume mapping is assigned, then automatically the data that was stored here by the previous container will now be available in this path within the new container, basically, right? So that's basically how it works. So what I just want to do now is copy this part within the container where I'm interested in, having the generated data and just map it like so, right? So this volume that will be created on my system is going to be attached to this part within the container. And, basically the data is going to be mapped or synchronized. So one more thing I need to include here is a port mapping. Just to explain a concept, I will specify 3306, 3306, right? But I already know this isn't going to work, right? Because I already have my SQL running on my system. So the issue is that since I have my SQL already installed, right? That's a regular installation, right? Not using Docker. That means I have my SQL running on port 3306, which is the default port for my SQL, right? So what happens is when the container is started, right, my SQL will be running on port 3306, within that container, right? So in order to map the port for the container to the port on my local system, then I have to do this port mapping, right? So now if I try to attach a port that has already been assigned on my local system to a port running within a container, then there's going to be conflicts, right? Because 3306 is already assigned to a process on my system, right? So for that to make more sense, I'll just bring up my terminal basically. Right, so this is everything we need to have as regards setting up MySQL using Docker. So now I'm going to type Docker compose up, right? And this is basically going to start all the services or all the containers defined in this file. So you may also use Docker-compose, right? So if Docker compose doesn't work, maybe try Docker-compose, and that should work if you have Docker installed already. Okay, so now, as you can see from the response here, it says error response from daemon, ports are not available, right? So it's trying to tell me that this port 3306 is not available because it is already being used by the MySQL process that I installed locally, right? So I'm trying to bind to port 3306 in the container, but because 3306 is already assigned to another process, then that port mapping will not work. But now what I'm going to do is change this port. That's the port on my system, which I'd like to map to the ports on the container, right? So I'm changing this to 3307. Then I'll run Docker compose up again. And now you can see that we have things running this time, right? Because port 3307 on my machine is not attached to anything or wasn't attached to anything before I started this container, right? So currently it's initializing the database and it's printing out a couple of information regarding the setup, right? So here we can see it says creating database AmdariDB, then creating user AmdariUser, which is the user we have right here, right? And it says giving user AmdariUser access to the schema AmdariDB, right? So whenever I want to log in, we can actually log in with these credentials. So it says plugin ready for connections, right? So that's fine. So what I'll do now is use an extension, right? The extension is called database. So I'll click on create connection. So to install this extension, you just need to go to the extensions, then search for database. All right, so you want to search for database clients. This database client extension with, you see this icon, right, by Weijian Chen. Right, so this is the extension I'm using currently. And there's a whole bunch of other extensions. For instance, this one is by Microsoft. Basically, you use this for SQL Server connection and all that, right? But so I'll click on this, then click on create connection. Then I'm presented with this view, right? So the host name is, going to be my local host or 127.0.0.1. The port is 3307, which is what we specified in the Docker container or in the YAML file rather. So for the username, I'll change this to AmdariUser. Again, that was specified here. And the password is AmdariUser password. So I'll just copy that and paste that right here. Then for database, I won't specify anything, right? Then I'll click on connect. So we can see a message here that says connect success. So I'll expand that and we can see the AmdariDB right here. And currently we don't have any table in that database, right? So we've been able to create my SQL database using Docker. Now we need to just write our code, right, to create a database or a table, right, and load data into that table. So I'll create a file here. I'll call it MySQL load.ipynb. Okay, so I would just create another terminal here. So I'll select the kernel, I'll select the virtual environment, the same one we used in the last two videos. Right, so I'd like to install a couple of packages to allow us connect to MySQL from within Python. So to do that, I'll type pip install MySQL. Then I'll also install SQL Alchemy. So those are the two libraries we actually need for now.